National emergency, war, or a similarly menacing crisis answers the political class's crucial question more effectively than anything else, because such a crisis has a uniquely effective capacity to dissipate the forces that otherwise would obstruct or oppose the government's expansion. This fact alerts us to the most important aspect of state power, namely, that it ultimately rests on and ceaselessly magnifies people's fears. As Butler Schaeffer has written, quote, "Fear can debilitate us, making us susceptible to the importunities of those who promise to alleviate our fears if only we will give the direction of our lives over to them. In this manner are institutions born, with the state demanding the greatest authority over us and promising release from our uncertainties." End quote. All animals experience fear, human beings perhaps most of all. Any animal incapable of fear would have been hard-pressed to survive, regardless of its size, speed, and other attributes. Fear alerts us to dangers that threaten our well-being and sometimes our very lives. Sensing fear, we respond by running away, hiding, or preparing to ward off the danger. To disregard fear is to place ourselves in possibly mortal jeopardy. Telling people not to be afraid is giving them advice they cannot take. Our evolved psychological and physiological makeup predisposes us to fear all sorts of actual and potential threats, however, even those that exist only in our imagination. The people who have the effrontery to rule us, who call themselves our government, understand this basic fact of human nature. They exploit it and they cultivate it. Whether they compose a warfare state or a welfare state, they depend on it to secure popular submission, compliance with official dictates, and on some occasions, affirmative cooperation with the state's enterprises and adventures. Without popular fear, no government could endure more than 24 hours. David Hume argued that all government rests on public opinion, and many others have endorsed his argument. But public opinion, I maintain, is not the bedrock of government. Public opinion itself rests on something deeper and more primordial: fear. Hume recognized that the opinions that support government receive their force from what he called other principles, among which he included fear. But he considered these other principles to be, quote, the secondary, not the originary, principles of government. Murray Rothbard considers fear briefly in his analysis of the anatomy of the state, classifying its instillment as, quote, another successful device by which the rulers secure from their subjects acceptance of, or at least acquiescence in, their domination. Quote, the present rulers, it was maintained, supply to the citizens an essential service for which they should be most grateful: protection against sporadic criminals and marauders, end quote. But Rothbard does not view fear as the fundamental basis on which the rulers rest their domination, as I do. Of course, as many scholars have recognized, ideology is critical to the long-term maintenance of state power. Yet every ideology that endows the state with legitimacy requires and is infused by some kind of fear. I contend that public fear is a necessary, though perhaps not a sufficient, condition for the viability of government as we know it. The fear need not be of the government itself, and indeed may be of the danger from which the government purports to protect the people. Of course, some of the threats that induce subjects to submit to government in the hope of gaining its protection, and thereby calming their fears, may be real ones. I am not maintaining that people who look to government for their salvation act entirely under the sway of illusory threats. Although I do insist that nowadays, if not always, many public fears arise in large part, if not entirely, from stimulation by the government itself. If the people's fears may be, 1, of the government itself, 2, of real threats from which the people look to the government for protection, and 3, of spurious threats from which people look to the government for protection, we must admit that the relative importance of each type of fear varies with time and place. In every case, however, the government seeks to turn public fear to its own advantage.
So let's move on to the real meat and potatoes of this presentation, cowardice. Now we're going to get into, see, the first section was like physical stuff. Then the next section is more emotional stuff. Now we're going to get into the deep-seated psychological material, because this is where it all falls apart for most people. Okay? And this is where most people don't have the necessary courage to really understand what the Second Amendment is truly about, what the right to self-defense, period, is truly about. Patrick Henry said, fear is the passion of slaves. And like, Frank Herbert in Dune said, fear is the mind killer. Well, I say fear is the freedom killer. The fastest way a population is going to descend into tyranny is when they remain in a consciousness of fear. And that's because fear of death is the beginning of slavery, as we'll talk about. I'm going to introduce a term most people probably have never heard of. It's called hoplophobia. Hoplophobia is the irrational fear of weapons. Here's a quote by Eric S. Raymond, who's a freedom advocate. He said, hoplophobia, like homophobia, is a displacement symptom. Hoplophobes fear their own forbidden feelings and urges to commit violence. This would be harmless, except that they project those feelings onto others. See, that's the real psychological motivation for not wanting weapons in your presence, is because they're so psychologically immature that they don't trust themselves with them. See, when I'm walking in the general population with weaponry, as I am right now, okay, it actually makes me more focused and more calm and more intent and watching every bit of my emotional makeup, because I realize the deadly force I have at my disposal. That makes me more responsible, because I'm already a responsible adult. Then when you add that actual ability to take life in self-defense, okay, it actually amplifies your responsible qualities in good people. See, that's what I'm trying to explain, is that hoplophobes, people who fear weapons, deep down inside, they're not really good people. Deep down inside, they don't trust themselves because they have these urges deep within their psyche that they would act upon at a whim, at a moment's notice. And that's why they fear weapons so much. It's a displacement symptom. This is called displacement in clinical psychology. Sigmund Freud also recognized it, and he recognized it as a symptom of immaturity. He said, and I don't care what you think of the man otherwise, I don't agree with everything he talked about psychologically, but on this he was dead on point. He said a fear of weapons is a sign of retarded sexual and emotional maturity. Absolutely on point. Couldn't have said it any better myself. And then the woman holding the pistol there in this meme says, my right to defend myself with a gun supersedes your ignorance and irrational fear of guns. And I couldn't agree with her anymore. Just because someone is uncomfortable with something doesn't trump a right. That's what we have to why we have to understand what rights are. That's why most people can't define what a damn right is in the year 2018. They can't just spit out the answer, a right is an action that does not cause harm to another sentient being. They can't spit that definition out. And that's why we're losing our rights. Because people don't even know what a right is. How could you defend what you don't know how to define? Just think about that for a moment. Yet this is where we are at societally. We're a nation of grown children. A nation of fearful grown children living under the stairs. Emotional maturity requires a developed understanding of self-defense. Because self-defense is part of self-love and self-respect. I'm better than my emotional, psychological, and entire makeup of my personality is actually more valuable than every single person in all of government that has ever lived or existed. That's the infinite value of my life, my mind, and my existence. That's how much self-respect I have. I'm more valuable than tyrants and oppressors and people who want to do violence unto other people. People who would enslave other people. Okay? I'm more valuable. My life is more valuable than people who would put other people into chains of slavery. That's the kind of self-respect I have for myself, and that's what other people, how they should value their own life and their own mind and their own psychological makeup if they were true adults. That's why my self-defensive rights come before somebody else's need to feel safe. It comes before somebody else's irrational fears. Stunted and childlike development is exhibited through fearful emotional arguments that are devoid of any rationality or logic. And believe me, there is a deluge of that in our society today. Modern-day political leftists and authoritarians suffer from this emotional arrested development due to ignorance and cowardice. Fear almost always stems from ignorance. Since they don't know how to use weapons to protect themselves, they irrationally fear that all weapons are going to harm them somehow, or they're going to harm someone else with them. When it comes to weapons, they react only with fear, and they insist that everyone else should have to lose their natural right of self-defense just so they can be allowed not to be afraid. This is the mentality of an immature, fearful, bratty child with poor or absent parenting. Government is only too happy, I'm sorry I have a spelling error there, I'll correct that in my final slides, is only too happy to step in and become the proxy parent for such grown children. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is why we have a two-party system in politics. One represents daddy, that's the Republican Party, who's going to keep everybody safe from cradle to grave. He's going to fight everybody's battles for them. And then we have mommy. That's the Democratic Party that's going to nurture and take care of everyone from cradle to grave. Don't you get it? That's the parent system. That's the psychological proxy parent system. And nobody's even thought of it. They don't even recognize it. It's staring them in the face. And they can't recognize it. And the reason why, they don't know who they are. If you don't know your own psychological makeup, and you don't know how the system of oppression and control is acting as a proxy for what you are secretly yearning and craving for, the absent parenting that most of us never really truly had. It's parental abandonment issues psychologically that drive that control dynamic. Yeah, exactly. So, you have children saying, I feel safer in gun-free zones because criminals aren't allowed to use guns in them, right? That's how it works, right? Yeah, that's how it works. And then you have brats like this, who, tragic things happen in their school. Well, I wish things like that wouldn't occur, but guess what? We have to also understand they're not always as we're told that they occurred either. They didn't always go down as we're told by the mainstream media and government that they went down. Okay? So let me tell you something. While I empathize that, classmates may have been harmed and killed, you're not taking my weapons. Not without bloodshed, my friends. You're not taking my weapons. You're not going to take 99% of the people who have weapons away from them. Not in America. You may get it done, but you're going to have to drop hydrogen bombs to do it. Let me tell you that. Know it like you know your own name or like you know the sun's coming up on the eastern horizon tomorrow. You'd have to drop hydrogen bombs on this country to take the people's weapons here. It ain't going to be like Europeans. It ain't going to be like Australians. You ain't going to do it like the Canucks, like the Euros, or like the Aussies. This is an entirely different animal you're dealing with in America. Believe it. Let me explain how children like that are output into our society. It's called social engineering. And if people don't know about it, they better look it up and they better start reading. Okay? And I call it what it really is. You want to use the scientific and the politically correct term or whatever? It's called social engineering. All right? But what I call it is what it really is, mind control. And that's what most people are under. They're under mind control. Okay? Social engineering is used to keep us ignorant and afraid. The socialist, communist, outcome-based education system that we have in place in this country is keeping people in a state of ignorance regarding inherent rights through indoctrination into postmodernism. This is what is being taught in universities all over this country, all over the world. Postmodern thought, which is all about think with your feelings, everything is relative, okay? And you could just believe whatever you want. And that'll basically make it so. And everybody's belief independently is just as valid as everybody else's belief. No, it's not. There's such a thing called truth. And then there's such a thing called aligning perception to truth, which is what our job as human beings should be to do. So we're not unthinking, irrational imbeciles. That's what critical thinking is. That's what our children should be being taught, critical thinking skills. But no, they're being taught how to use their feels to come to conclusions. You know? Look, I'm an advocate for emotions. People have to get in touch deeply with their emotional selves. I mean, our emotions are a compass, a guidance system for morality, so that we can feel what we do to other people. But you can't come to logical, correct conclusions about truth and what's going on in the world just by feeling it. You have to read and research and study and weed out contradictions and use scientific methodology. You know, you're not going to come to conclusions about what is true and real with your feelings. Sorry, it doesn't work that way. Cultural Marxism and social Darwinism have become the basis for, quote, determining what rights are. School shooting events are employed to drive an agenda of disarmament under the pretext of safety. Such programs directly target the minds of the youth to instill postmodern ideology, socialism and communism, and the disarmament agenda, all of which accelerate the destruction of human freedom. And then we have the mainstream media, who is directly in league with intelligence agencies and big tech corporations such as Google, furthering the agenda of oppression through censorship of dissenting information. Children and adults increasingly believe today that unless information came from the government, that it is not true. They believe government is the only legitimate official source of information. Folks, how many people in this room have read the book by Jim Keith called Mass Control? Mass Control by the gentleman named Jim Keith. I want to count. Please leave your hand up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 people. Absolutely unacceptable. Absolutely unacceptable. Everyone here, if you want to know what is taking place in America and throughout the world, should have already read the book by Jim Keith called Mass Control. Mass Control by Jim Keith. He was assassinated for writing this book. He was found dead under suspicious circumstances with no connections to the crime, no one arrested for it, because of the information he released in this book about exactly how much and how deeply embedded the Central Intelligence, members of Central Intelligence in the United States, have embedded themselves in the United States media corporations and entities. And he discovered that it is far worse than how embedded the KGB was in Soviet Russia media. But only, see, there's a big difference between them and us. There's a big difference between people living under Soviet rule in the USSR and people today in America. The people living under Soviet rule, when the KGB owned every aspect of just about every media outlet that they were allowed to see and hear, laughed at it. They laughed at it. They thought it was a joke. They turned the news on at night and said to one another, "Here comes the KGB report." Literally. Literally, it was a common phrase. The KGB report is what the nightly news was called in Soviet Russia. Here, full-grown adults, or people who think of themselves as adults, actually believe that they're being given critical information that they need to hear and understand when they're watching the nightly news, and don't believe that the CIA 100% controls the news media and the outlets that put forward the news, so-called news. This is how naive and childish the American population is. And it's because they don't do reading. It's because they're too busy flipping through Instagram photos. Okay? Mass Control by Jim Keith. Indispensable reading. So, this meme says, Operation Mockingbird, talked about in the book, was a fully implemented CIA program to spread disinformation throughout American media. CIA Director William Colby testified to the Church Committee that over 400 CIA agents were active in U.S. media to control what was reported through American mainstream television, newspapers, and magazines. Do you know when that was given?
70s.
In the 1970s. I believe it was 1971, if I have the year correct. But it was the early 1970s. Could you imagine how bad it is today? Yeah, and then YouTube and Google want to make it worse by actually censoring people. They don't understand that this is the opening volley of a war. This is the opening volley of civil war. And they don't understand how serious what they're doing by censoring alternative views are. Let's get to the psychological heart of the matter, the real psychological heart. People don't want the responsibility of self-defense. They want somebody else to be responsible for their self-defense. They don't want to take that natural responsibility that cannot actually be delegated to anyone else and own it. And there's a reason for that. They fear the possibility that they may be injured or killed in the exercise of that personal responsibility, and that they are also highly fearful of the possibility that they themselves may need to shoot and kill another human being in their own defense. This is one of the greatest fears of human beings. See, they can't envision that they actually may have to take the life of another human being. So I ask everyone here today and everyone watching, if someone was attempting to take your life or freedom, or the life or the freedom of those you love, do you know whether or not you could, in fact, willfully kill another human being?
Yes.
How many people have actually really deeply sat with themselves and thought about that potentiality? You know? That's what shadow work is. You know, psychological work is not always positive. Sometimes you have to envision doing the worst things that you may need to do. You know, and there's the people who are going to be coming for those rights and freedom and possibly lives. You know, because they don't call it a police state for no reason. You'll notice that it's not called a politician state, right? It's not called a judge state, a banker state, right? It's not called any of those things. It's called a police state. There's a reason, because those are the people who lock it down. Those are the people who come for the rights. Those are the people who come for the guns. Those are the people who come for the lives. And if you don't know that, you're a very psychologically immature child. Fear of doing what needs to be done. This is all part of, overarchingly, this is all part of fear of freedom. Fear of self-defense is fear of freedom. Because in freedom is contained self-defense. You cannot actually be free without taking the responsibility of your own self-defense. No one else can actually provide that as a service to you, no matter how much you think government is beneficent and actually wants to protect you. No, it wants to control you. It wants to protect its masters, who it thinks are somehow, that's going to somehow magically save them. Like, they're going to be the last ones eaten by the great beast, you know? But as long as they're the last one to go into its, you know, huge jaws, then that's great. They won somehow. That's how older followers think. This is how retarded they are. You have to be broken at a soul level to think that you cannot kill another person who is coming for your life. Now, I want to give an allegorical example. How many people watch The Walking Dead? I find it a pretty interesting allegorical television show about what would happen in a complete societal collapse and how people would behave toward each other. And it's probably much more sanitized than what you would actually see. But in this recent episode of the television show The Walking Dead, the so-called hero, who incidentally is a former cop, Rick, did not exemplify a moral person when he spared the murderous psychopath Negan. Negan in this allegory represents government. And he says, I am the New World Order. You're going to give me 50% of all your earnings, which is what any good definition of slavery basically is, except total slavery is you're giving me 100%. You're doing all the work and giving me 100% of what you earned. But he's saying, I'm going to be the new king. You're going to do the work. You're going to give me 50%. Okay? And he says, and if you don't give me 50%, you're going to die. That's his New World Order, explained in the Walking Dead TV show. So this guy, Rick, who's supposed to be the hero, finally gets a chance to kill this guy, and he leaves him alive. And what I say is, he wasn't doing anything moral by sparing his life. He was actually acting immorally. He was endangering every single other life in the entire group by leaving him alive. Sparing his life was the equivalent of letting loose a wild, hungry tiger into the middle of a village full of children. Because he couldn't do what needed to be done. Because he has this ridiculous romantic notion of keeping people in a cage is somehow less barbaric than ending their life. When they're an absolute animalistic psychopath that has proven that they're just a murderous beast and needs to be dealt with as such. Would you go and try to capture, if a tiger came into a village and killed a bunch of children, do you think you're going to just go, take it, cage it, and then keep it in the village with the children? I mean, really? What would be done? You'd go and hunt it with a high-powered rifle and end the threat. That's what a sensible person would do. I understand, look, I'm all for being 100% just as harmless to animals as I want to be to people. But there is a limit when something is coming and killing you and eating you. That's called very simple self-defense and self-preservation. It doesn't mean you're making that the goal of your entire life. It means that when the threat presents itself, you do the moral and actual effective thing to continue to live and not have your people devoured. And that's the state that we're at right now with government. Because government is opening up its jaws and getting ready to clamp down on our throats. It has been doing it. I keep telling people war has already begun. War has already begun. 10,000 people have been killed without trial by police in America since 9/11 on the streets of America. And you don't think that's war statistics? You don't think those are the statistics of war? I'll give you statistics of war where not that many people have been killed in war. Police have murdered without trial 10,000 United States citizens since 9/11 occurred. And we're standing here having presentations. Really? Really? See, because people are fearful of fighting a battle that they believe they might not win. And that's not a mentality of good people. That's a mentality of cowards. Cowards think like that. Good people don't think like that. Okay? Good people don't put their life before they put freedom. Most people are afraid of righteous rebellion. And let me just say something. Thank God for the revolutionaries of America who fought and made it possible for me to even get these ideas into my mind and speak them. Thank the creator of the universe for those men and women. And people think that wasn't a legitimate righteous rebellion. That they believe that wasn't a legitimate righteous rebellion against England. And we'll talk negatively against the American revolutionaries. In America. Just because they think all of them were slave owners. No. It was less than 1%. And it certainly wasn't the revolutionaries of the North who were trying to abolish slavery back then. Particularly some of the founding fathers like Thomas Jefferson, who wrote anti-slavery clauses into the original Declaration of Independence, and then the Southern delegates who were making tons of money from the Ivory Coast slave trade insisted that the anti-slavery clauses be removed, or they wouldn't sign it. They wouldn't even come back into committee in the Second Continental Congress. But people don't know that history. No, they only know what their communist professors told them about this time period. Most people are afraid of righteous rebellion because they believe we couldn't fight the government and win, which isn't true. They'll say things like, you couldn't fight the government with an AR-15. Yeah, not one person, but 100 million American gun owners with semi-automatic battle rifles. Like I said, you'd have to drop hydrogen bombs on America to defeat it. All the armies, not just no army, all the armies on the face of the earth combined could not defeat the firepower of the American population. And we would do it quickly. That's real battle logistics, if you understand the numbers involved, which most people don't. It's like an imbecile flat earther who doesn't understand the size of the earth. You know, they don't grasp the actual size and magnitude of the earth because they don't have those actual physical understanding in science and mathematics and geometry and physics in hand. They don't have those tools in hand. So it's the same way when you try to present legitimate battle logistics to somebody who has never studied any military engagement styles or logistics. They're simply incorrect and it's not true. As a matter of fact, U.S. Army War College analysts have published literature on the effectiveness of small arms in urban asymmetric warfare, which is the likely form and nature of a rebellion against a tyrannical government in the modern world. These logistics are often completely ignored by armchair strategists and opponents of the Second Amendment who are too cowardly to take up arms in the first place. They believe compliance with tyrants and despots is a strategy that will somehow, quote-unquote, keep them safe long-term. But that coward strategy never actually works out, as history has demonstrated time and time again throughout the ages. Once again, they prove that they're ignorant of human history. People who comply with tyrants, they just extend their lifespan a tiny little bit, and when the tyrant's done with them, they take their head off. And see, this is what people think of. They think they're so smart by saying this. And exactly, they have their head up their ass and have no idea what the reality of it is. Hey, you with the guns, your paranoid fantasies about fighting a rebellion against a theoretical future fascist government takeover do not trump my rights to demand appropriate and reasonable public health policies to stop gun violence. Sincerely, the rest of the American people. Sincerely, the rest of the American people with their head firmly lodged up their ass. Okay? Because every statement in this meme is incorrect. It's not paranoia to believe that government becomes tyrannical. It's a historical fact. It's not a fantasy about fighting a rebellion with small arms. As a matter of fact, the next two slides are going to be historical examples where that has been done and accomplished. Okay? And no, my right to protect my freedom with firearms does trump your right to feel safe and demand that they be taken away because of quote-unquote public health policies. Yes, they do. My rights trump that. Everyone's right to self-defense trumps that.
Over the ages, governments refined their appeals to popular fears, fostering an ideology that emphasizes the people's vulnerability to a variety of internal and external dangers from which their governors, of all people, are represented to be their protectors. Government, it is claimed, protects the populace from external attackers and from internal disorder, both of which are portrayed as ever-present threats. Sometimes the government, as if seeking to nourish this mythology with grains of truth, does protect people in this fashion. Even the shepherd protects his sheep, but he does so to serve his own interests, not theirs. And when the time comes, he will shear or slaughter them as his interest dictates.
Fear of death is the beginning of slavery. See, and this goes to real consciousness, because we don't know who we are. We don't know who we are in consciousness. See, we don't do the psychological work to really know ourselves. That's the first tenet of all the mystery school traditions of consciousness. Know thyself. Fear of physical death is the beginning of every form of slavery that has ever existed. Those who believe in physical material existence as the only reality generally exist in a continual existential state of the fear of death. Because such individuals hold the material realm as prime and ignore and discount any spiritual existence, they are almost always afraid to fight for freedom. They fear death because they don't know who they are. They deny the spirituality that is inherent in freedom, and they don't understand anarchy as the intrinsic state of a free being, meaning no rulers, no masters, no slaves. That's what anarchy is. It's not chaos. It's not lawlessness. It's not disorder. Anarchy means no rulers, no masters, no slaves. Literally means that. This is why the internal great work of consciousness is the foundational work of a sovereign being and the ultimate solution to the condition of slavery. True consciousness means knowing who you are and who the enemy is. It means knowing your surroundings and the nature of the situation in which you exist, in which you find yourself, and confronting that head on. It means understanding that you are not just a physical body, but a spiritual being having a physical experience here for the purpose of learning and growing spiritually. As long as you fear death, you can be made a slave. The threat of slavery will always be present as long as people live in a state of existential, satanic doubt when it comes to who they are in consciousness. That not knowing that they are eternal spiritual beings having a physical experience on earth. They don't have that spirituality inside them, and that's why they can be made to obey, because they fear death more than they fear slavery. Sun Tzu in The Art of War said, if you know the enemy and you know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. If you know yourself, but you do not know the enemy, for every victory gained, you will also suffer a defeat. But if you know neither the enemy nor yourself, you will succumb in every battle. Courage is sorely absent and desperately needed. I'm getting ready to wrap it up. This is my last section. Only a completely immoral coward would say, let slavery continue to reign, just because death might be the alternative. There are things in this world, in this universe, that are worse than death, and slavery is one of them. The response of the cowards is always that we couldn't possibly fight the forces of tyranny because we would lose. A righteous rebellion for freedom is not waged only because there would be a significant chance of winning. That's not why righteous rebellion is waged. You think people who have waged righteous rebellion always knew they were going to win? You think they sat down and calculated, oh, we're definitely going to win this thing, so let's start fighting. It's not how it works. They put their lives on the line. They didn't know what the outcome was going to be. The proper motivation is that slavery, to fight a righteous rebellion, is knowing that slavery is morally wrong and should not be allowed to continue, whatever the cost may be. Real rebels don't care whether they might die in physical combat. And I'm not talking about soldiers here. They are following the dictates of their masters and not thinking. They're just obeying. I'm talking about real rebels. They don't care whether they might die in combat. That's what a real warrior is. A real warrior is not an order-following soldier. They're not fighting who they're fighting because they were told to fight them. They're fighting who they're fighting because they recognize the immorality of the opposing side and know that they must be beaten at whatever the cost may be. They don't fight because they desire only to physically survive. They fight because they would rather fight and die than to accept slavery as the alternative. That is what liberty or death actually means. It means that the instinct for the preservation of freedom overcomes the instinct for the preservation of life. Only someone in a purely satanic mindset chooses for life to be preserved, even if freedom is not preserved. This is a quote by Harriet Tubman, who helped many slaves escape to the northern states during the times of oppression of black slavery in early America. She said there was one of two things I had a right to, liberty or death. If I could not have one, I would take the other, for no man should take me alive. I should fight for liberty as long as my strength lasted. That's a rebel. That's a real woman.
Dr. Higgs, fear is a recurrent theme in all of your books, and in fact, it's in the subtitle of your most recent book. Why?
Because fear is the most elemental and powerful human emotion. It's the thing that human beings are least able to ignore. Fear also puts people in a frame of mind where it's very difficult for them to behave rationally. They're more likely to behave instinctively, and they're more likely to look for salvation wherever they can find it. And for that reason, governments have always relied on fear to keep subjects in line, and they're continuing to rely on it today.
Could you give an example?
Absolutely. Everything we know about how governments in their current form came into being tells us they arose from conquest, from one group over another group, and that meant that fear was involved in the very beginning because it was usually violence, warfare that brought about this conquest, and after the conquest was completed, the threat of violence continued to be applied to subject peoples in order to make them cough up tribute to their conquerors. And so fear for people's very lives is at the root of governments as they exist in the world today. And even though many people may not feel a surface fear or an awareness of fear of the government, it's very easy to make them afraid of government if you start to remind them of ways in which the government might hurt them if they get out of line.
The fear of chaos. This is what keeps this system going. Chaos can't be viewed as something to fear. It's got to be viewed as a teacher, a harsh teacher, but a teacher nonetheless. See, chaos teaches us through the apophatic process what not to do. Okay? That's a bad idea. Okay? You probably shouldn't do that. If your desire is not to burn your hand to the point where it's blistering and flesh is starting to peel off of it. If you don't care about whether that happens, by all means, keep it right on that stove. Okay? Right on that electric stove. But see, if you say, I don't want to be burned, there are requirements for obtaining that condition. It means you can't keep your hand on something that is extraordinarily hot, or natural law will take over and burn your flesh. Doesn't require your belief. That's how it works. Well, this is humanity. Humanity is the little child that is a little slow, and they want not to be burned, yet simultaneously they insist, no, I want to put my hand on the burner while the range is on and not be burned simultaneously. Well, good luck with that, folks, because it doesn't work that way. You don't want to be burned, the hand can't be kept there while the stove is on. The end. You don't want negative, self-inflicted suffering and chaos in your life, you got to align your behavior to natural law, which means you got to know the difference objectively between right and wrong, and willfully, through your free will, deliberately choose the right action over the wrong action. Then you won't be burned. But as long as you have your hand on that stove, which means you're in opposition to natural law, enjoy the burn. Enjoy it. Right? Get used to it till the flesh melts off the bone and then the bones turn into dust. Because that's what you're going to get. That's how it works. And again, nobody wants to hear that. They don't want to hear that the natural laws don't care about you. They work flawlessly all the time and bring you the result that you're creating. The control and slavery system is actually about the limitation of free will through the destruction of possibility. See, all they've done right? The old world order used to be religion and priest kings, right? We're in between you and God. We're the intercessors, the intermediaries. We make the law, you're our subjects, you're our slaves, you obey, or it's our wrath. All they've done is take the concept of a singular ruler, which was the old world order, and they've converted it into the concept of now there's a ruling class called government that gets to make up what we tell you you may or may not do. Okay? And they're up here at the top of the pyramid now. That's all. They turned it from a monarchy to somewhat of an oligarchy. But it's the same concept. We're the moral masters that you have a moral obligation to obey, and you're the slave class, that has an obligation to obey our commands. That's it. Nothing changed. All they did is say, well, no, people don't no longer believe in the priest king, so we need to create an institution where this quote-unquote authority is seemingly diffused through many people. It's always been nonsense. It's always been mind control. It's not going to be anything else other than that until it goes away. True freedom includes infinite possibility because infinite possibility, by definition, includes the possibility for chaos. For real freedom to exist, we have to accept, hey, things might not go right all the time. We live in a physical domain, a physical world. Hey, there could be dangers, Nothing could ever be sanitized or made completely safe as far as physical world activities are concerned. There's always going to be the possibility something could happen, go wrong, somebody could get hurt, chaos could happen. Okay? If you live in that state of fear that that's going to happen, what is that? Is that high consciousness or low consciousness? It's low consciousness. Low consciousness can only create what? Chaos. The fear of chaos itself can only get you more chaos because it's based in fear. As we see, just keep referring to that expression chart. Go online. I have slides of it online. It's in videos I've done. Print it. Read it. Look at it. Print it and stick it up in your home. Understand how that chart works. Those expressions that I went over, those 10 expressions. The possibility, of chaos from manifesting, the possibility that it may manifest has to be embraced without fear if we're going to be truly free. It must be embraced. You have to say, I am going to allow for the possibility that chaos may occur. Because that's getting out of the consciousness of fear. That's what will lead to freedom. Removing that fear. The fear of the possibility of chaos is actually equated to the fear of true freedom. When somebody says, I can't ever believe that a system with no masters could work out. I can't even envision how it could work out. What's that called? What's been deadened in that person? What have they lost? Imagination. There it is. That is actually the equivalent of the death of the imagination. Now, what is the imagination? The imagination is the powerful ability of the human mind to envision a different state or condition than the one which is already manifested in the present. So imagination must first be present in the mind in order to create a different state of existence than the one currently being experienced. And this is because, according to the principle of mentalism, for any different state to manifest in the physical world, the plane of effects, it must first exist within the mind or the plane of causality. If the imagination is stifled or destroyed, and the destruction of the imagination is what I refer to as total mind control. You can't go into any more total mind controlled state as the imagination being dead. All right? If that happens, any positive change to our state of existence becomes completely impossible. And this is where many people are already at. The fear of the possibility of chaos is more than even the fear of true freedom. It is the death of the imagination. It is putting the mind permanently in the cage. Okay? You can't let that force within us called the imagination die. because that's the only way to envision a way out of the prison. You have to envision it first, then you have to put those thoughts and emotions that you used for that envisioning process into actual action so that it becomes manifested in the physical world. Through their fear of the possibility of chaos, which is actually the fear of true freedom, most people advocate the legitimacy and continuance of authority in government and are therefore actually advocating the legitimacy and continuance of violence and slavery. Those who believe that authority is necessary and that it must continue because of this fear of chaos have actually been duped into believing that human slavery is necessary. And get this, folks, human slavery must therefore continue in order to prevent chaos. Now imagine that. Imagine that. That's what statism is, though. That's what the religion called the belief in government or statism is. It is the belief that human slavery is necessary and must continue indefinitely in order to prevent chaos from manifesting. Now, tell me how that could possibly work. Can violence and slavery, which is actually what government is a euphemism for, statism and government are just euphemisms for violence and slavery. Okay? Can violence and slavery ever possibly prevent chaos? Why? What? Why can't it? Because they are chaos. Violence and slavery are chaos. We are already in the state of chaos. Being held under the threat of violence and duress, which is slavery, is the state of chaos. So forget about fearing chaos coming on. You're in it now. Surprise, surprise. Hate to break the news to you all. Okay? We're already in the state of chaos. We need to create real order by getting rid of violence and slavery.
So slide back down, close your eyes.